In 2001, Nintendo did something unexpected. They handed the reins of one of their most popular franchises to another company. In a shocking turn of events, Capcom would come to develop 3 Zelda games for Nintendo. They were originally tasked with remaking Zelda 1 on the Game Boy Color to get their feet wet, and hopefully that experience would prompt them to develop even stronger original Zeldas going forward. Though, due to a number of unforeseen difficulties during the porting process, the idea morphed into a trilogy of games which would each represent a piece of the Triforce. The Mystical Seed games, or the Triforce Trilogy as they were once known. Each would focus on a distinct gameplay theme, though since one of them was lost to time, we would only come to know 2. Oracle of Ages, the game focused on puzzles, and Oracle of Seasons, the game focused on action. The idea here is that you play them both one after the other, and link them to get crossover elements. Main campaign moments will be slightly altered if you've started the second game, including the ending, which will have an added epilogue segment tying both games together. There is no official starting point. The manga adaptation begins with Oracle of Seasons, but that seriously doesn't mean anything. I mean, I started with Ages because it had time travel in it, and I thought that was neat. In order to allow the video to flow more naturally, I'm going to discuss each game separately, cross-comparing them when the moment arises, and saving all the linked game features for the end when it is relevant. Let's begin with Oracle of Ages. We are now in a post-Ocarina of Time world, one with Din, Nehru, Furore, Goron, Zora, and time travel. It's no surprise that Oracle of Ages would borrow heavily from that framework, seeing as Ocarina of Time is without a doubt the most influential Zelda in the series, or at least it was for a time. It features the goddess this game was centered around, Nehru, the Oracle of Time, and is set in the land of Labrina. In a startlingly similar fashion to Link's Awakening, Link sorta just appears without a clue as to where he is or what he's supposed to be doing. This sets in motion the core conflict of Ages. The sorceress Verin is unleashed upon the world, possesses Nehru, travels back to the past, and shapes the future to her liking. Your goal, then, is to fix everything Verin breaks by traveling between the past and present, finding 8 dungeons with mystical items. I think you get the drill by this point. Whereas Link's Awakening felt like the build-up to a cruel punchline, Ages feels like an assortment of memorable moments leading up to a climactic battle. You go from place to place on a whim, fixing various issues Verin has caused, like the poisoning of the water in Zora's domain or the eruption in Symmetry City. There's no rhyme or reason why you're going anywhere in particular, you're just kinda collecting the mystical artifacts and exploring new areas until you have what you need to storm the Black Tower and defeat Verin. As a villain, she's nothing special. She certainly makes an impression. I like her design, and I like how successful she is at destroying the timeline. However, she doesn't have that X factor you'd expect from a primary villain, not the same way Ganon or Majora do. She's contained to this one game and doesn't get a whole lot of screen time. The time she does have is dedicated to her monologuing about her evil plan, and this is likely because she's a tool sent to defeat Link by Twinrova, who are the actual villains of the overarching story. I remember being dumbfounded when I walked up to the Black Tower and suddenly I'm being told that Ralph is the Queen's ancestor and you've got to go stop him from attempting to kill Verin. It's an interesting conflict, but it comes out of fuck all nowhere, and that's how most of the story feels. It's hard to enjoy the stories of Ages and Seasons separately. They're really supposed to be experienced one after the other, so it can end with the epilogue crossover. Unfortunately, it means that both Ages and Seasons have a hard time standing on their own using their narratives. Kind of a shame right off the heels of one of the most unique stories in Zelda history. I am surprised by just how far the time travel is stretched in Ages when compared to Ocarina. While it was never a prevalent thought, it did bug me that Ocarina didn't use its time travel very often. It was refreshing to see a world where Ganon had won, and to play a grown-up Link who was mechanically evolved, but the only points at which it made sense to travel between the past and the future for progression was at the bottom of the well and within the Spirit Temple. Other than that, it was a linear child track and a linear adult track. It separated Ocarina from other games of its ilk, but it didn't really run with the concept the way Ages does. In the beginning, you were limited to preset locations where you can jump between the time periods, and there are progression puzzles built around this ability. It's not so complicated at first. To obtain the Mystery Seeds, you need only travel to the past and explore the forest in that time period. However, once you finish the second dungeon, the way forward becomes deliciously complex. You're told to head south toward the Crescent Island, and for that you need a raft. The guy who'll make a raft for you needs some rope, and that rope is supposedly in possession of someone on the opposite side of the river who hasn't developed it yet. Ralph tells you of a grave in the present that may hold what you're looking for, but he doesn't tell you where the grave might be. You're left to piece that together on your own. I figured he meant in the graveyard that you visit at the beginning, and sure enough, you meet one of your first animal buddies here, visit the grave in question, find both the Zora flippers and the rope, and go back to the raft maker. Though you finally have everything you need, he then requires you to find a sea chart so you won't get lost. This time, Ralph's only clue is a weird guy who sells maps. If you've played Zelda before, you most likely know what this means, but if not, there's a new event on the overworld in the form of your next animal buddy who gives you new traversal abilities. This gives you access to Tingle one room over, where you get the sea chart, then the raft, and then sail out for Crescent Island. Except even now you aren't done. You're stranded on the island, your belongings are stolen by these adorable lizard creatures, and you have to find all of your items again in an elaborate, insanely satisfying puzzle before accessing the third dungeon, which is itself an elaborate, insanely satisfying puzzle. Oracle of Ages is supposedly the Triforce of Wisdom, where the mechanical theme is puzzles. Almost everything you do is a puzzle, and while that might be overwhelming for some players, it tickles me greatly. I adore how puzzled I was at almost every point of progression in Ages. As soon as you get the ability to freely travel between the time periods, Ages wastes no time taking advantage of that. They make you think about where you're teleporting. For example, entering Zora's domain requires you take into account both maps simultaneously in order to correctly travel back and forth to access different areas. Everything in the southwest quadrant of the map is gradually moving east as time goes on, which means when you travel to the past, everything will be further westward. Jabu Jabu will also be smaller in the past than in the present. King Zora will die of a sickness if you don't find the key in the library, which can be accessed in both time periods, but you can only get what you're looking for in one. In one particularly memorable instance, not unlike the Spirit Temple, there is a dungeon that can be explored in both the past and the present. The chief difference is that Ocarina of Time just about spells this out to you, while Oracle of Ages leaves it a mystery. You go through the usual motions, eventually get stuck, retrace your steps, until you come to the conclusion that there are simply no other options. Meanwhile, the tool you need to progress is sitting in your inventory, staring you in the face every time you press the pause button. It doesn't fall into the same trap as the Stone Tower Temple either, since you don't need to constantly enter and exit the temple to switch back and forth. You only time travel once. Whatever you did in the past affects the temple in the present, so the puzzle is simply to notice that you can time travel at all. It is so refreshing to play a game this well structured, one that makes time travel its gameplay conceit rather than its window dressing. Oracle of Ages is like a gigantic puzzle box you solve piece by piece, and every piece is important. The overworld progression, the trading side quest, the heart piece rewards, the dungeons. I'll admit, at some points it can feel overwhelming. The trade sequence this time is a little more difficult because Labrina is much larger with a multitude of different people and races. You trade with so many of them, but at least it isn't as repetitive as it could get in the Wind Waker. You're still transporting item to item to item until you get your reward. This time, a powered-up sword. It's such a long quest that the reward feels earned. It encourages you to talk to everyone you find, to truly explore Labrina. This time, there aren't any strangely placed heart pieces. Cracked walls indicate bombable walls in the overworld. It's up to you to find out how to get there instead, a much better way to handle bombs. Some of these are devious too. They force you to travel between the time periods so you can MacGyver your way into places that previously seemed inaccessible. They're often in plain view, so it's about finding your way to them, then finding out if it even exists at all. You'll find another collectible in dungeons and other secret areas that are pretty ahead of their time for Zelda. Secret rings. You can get them appraised in town, and they each have a host of different effects. They range from increased damage output at the cost of lowered defense, increased swimming speed, increased bomb damage. There are a lot of them. The Oracle games developed a loot system for Zelda long before Breath of the Wild was in its infancy. They are really cool rewards and give you a ton of reasons to spend rupees, a problem many Zelda games seem to struggle with. Having a huge list of rings with cool effects is a nice way to make sure your money is always valuable, and that the secrets you find aren't just more money. For some reason that happens a lot in these games. So pretty much everything you do in Ages is a puzzle, and you're rewarded very well for solving each and every puzzle on offer. If so many traditionally simple elements are now puzzling, What does that say for the dungeons, which were always supposed to be more puzzling than everything else? Well, it means the dungeons are absolutely fantastic, rock-solid, head-scratching nightmares. In the best way. Here we have highlights like Jabu Jabu's belly, infinitely more complex than its ocarina variant. There are 3 switches that control the water level, and not unlike the water temple, it becomes very confusing very quickly. Some rooms won't make sense until they're submerged in water, and you have that aha moment. To obtain the boss key, you must first realize what the room itself is telling you. There's a block of water and a high ledge. You've got to keep in mind the layout of the dungeon and realize that directly below that square is a high ledge with a hookshot point to bridge the gap. It doesn't sound hard, but considering how much you're forced to wander around intricate pathways, it's quite easy to fumble halfway through, what with your mind juggling so much information. Every time you change the water level, you both open and close different pathways, meaning you need to keep an extraordinarily large mental map that tracks where you can reach the water level switches and where you can exit, adaptively adding onto it whenever you hit a switch. All of the best dungeons on offer promote a macro level of thinking. The aforementioned 6th temple, Mermaid's Cave, which can be accessed in both the past and the present, Jabu Jabu's belly and the water level switches, the ancient tomb and its rotating entrances. All of them force you to think about the room layout overall, what connects where, and in what order to enter them. Moonlit Grotto is all about getting this central switch entrance to fall underneath the dungeon so that you can use it to access the lower floor. You do this by breaking the crystals that support it, hidden throughout the dungeon. It affords a similar level of freedom to something like Eagle's Tower, where you can go about breaking the crystals in whatever order you see fit. It's just that one of them is devilishly difficult to figure out. Your dungeon item is the Seed Shooter, an upgrade to the Seed Satchel, and you can immediately use it to light a fire just out of your reach. That's all the game itself is willing to teach you about the Seed Shooter. It leaves you to experiment and find out what other uses it has. If you aren't willing to do so, you're about to find yourself in a mighty pickle. One of the crystals is out of reach, in an odd position. Your bombs won't do the trick, you can't make your way over to it for a sword swing. How do you throw something in such a precise way that it'll destroy the crystal? It drove me up the wall. I kept trying different things. I left the room, searched the entire dungeon for an alternate entrance, until I started testing out the Seed Shooter and found that it bounced off walls. My mind was racing. I went back to that crystal, aimed my shooter, and broke it. I was ecstatic. And I had learned an important skill that the rest of the dungeon was keen to test now that I'd figured it out on my own. The Crown Dungeon also borrows from Eagle's Tower, the obstacle blocks that raise and lower upon hitting the switch. It is a decently sized dungeon with colored blocks in almost every room. Hitting any of the switches will change the blocks in the entire dungeon, just like in Eagle's Tower. This makes progression very complicated, since again, you have to think on a macro level or you'll get stuck often. What will hitting the switch change? What doors will it open? What doors will it close? Rarely will you have a dilemma that only lasts one room. Switches are placed so out of the way that you're forced to think about that one room across the dungeon after you hit one. It's an amazing feeling to map out a correct path in your mind. The dungeon map doesn't tell you much, only where you have and haven't been, which means all you can rely on is your mental map. Unfortunately, I do feel like this ambitious focus on puzzles just about reaches its breaking point in a few instances. The Skull Dungeon is vast and complicated, and for a while I was really into it. There's some tricky puzzles and platforming sections to sink your teeth into, like these areas where you have to sprint like a cheetah to escape the rapidly rising lava and get to the end. Those runs were so intense that when I cleared one, I would let out a sigh of relief. Seriously, I would visibly recline and let out a breath I'd been holding in. Near the end, though, there's only one long, drawn-out path you can take to the boss. This would be fine, except whenever you die, you're sent back to the beginning. Normally, you're given a teleporter to take you further into the dungeon, usually closer to the dungeon boss. Except in the Skull Dungeon, that teleport is useless, and the only efficient way back is from the beginning. After death, or even sometimes when you simply leave a room, many of the traps and puzzles reset, and this forces you to retread that same path, completing many of the same puzzles and combat sections over again. Not only are there many opportunities on that path to accrue damage, like falling in the lava or being hit by enemies, the boss isn't exactly a pushover. He's not brutal, but he does require the player to get close to him for damage, which can get dangerous when his minions respawn. I was stuck on this boss for a long time, not necessarily because he was hard, but because I took so much damage getting to him and so much time that I had almost forgotten what his patterns were by the time I dragged myself back. The dungeon itself is fulfilling on a base level, but its layout does not promote backtracking particularly well, and it became easily frustrating near the end because of that. Still, I would not hesitate to call these dungeons brilliant. I especially love the way each dungeon will recycle mechanics and get you familiar with them, so that their more challenging variants later on won't appear too jarring. They ease you into concepts gradually. These rotating entrances are used in many of these dungeons, and each appearance they get just a little more complicated. At first you need to find a way to enter it from another side. That's it. Later on you need to enter it from another side, and then enter from another side, and then enter from another side, and on and on and on until there are stars in your eyes. As early as the first dungeon, you start pushing these Rubik's Cubes in specific ways so that they land on the correct color, or these colored tiles that change color when you jump on them. It isn't as if Ages is breaking new ground by doing this. In fact, the jumping color puzzle in particular is not great. But as soon as you get to a puzzle like this later on, you're ready to tackle this more challenging variant because you've done simpler versions of it in the past. Much like Link's Awakening, your set of items have a lot of longevity that help this puzzle familiarity, with a focus on upgrades rather than entirely unique items. From the seed satchel to the seed shooter, from the wooden shield to the mirror shield, from the switch hook to the long hook, from the power bracelet to the power glove, you figure out early on that you can ricochet seeds off walls using the seed shooter, and at some point later, a dungeon will ask you to do it again. You get familiar with the switch hook and its limits, and then your reach is extended. That switch hook is super unique. Imagine Trafalgar Law's room ability. You switch with whatever object you target. That's not exactly how Law's Devil Fruit works, but hey, that's not this video, is it? It has much better dungeon bookends. Ironic that the game purportedly focused on puzzles has great boss encounters, but it does so through unusual means. Many of them are puzzles in and of themselves. Smog comes to mind first. Using the Cane of Samaria, you've got to make temporary bridges to put them back together, all the while avoiding their body parts and the fire that spews from them. It's an odd way to approach boss design, but Ages uses it well. You've got to use the switch hook on Plasmarine in such a way that its projectiles will hit itself instead of you. Ramrock runs the full gambit of dungeon items, and you've got to figure out which phases are weak to which items. This one stumped me in particular, trying to figure out what it meant when he grew hands, or when he had his shield up. I tried to go at him swords first, when in reality he was the culmination of everything the dungeons had been teaching the player up to that point. About strategizing, about thinking first. It didn't seem far-fetched to pull out my seed shooter or my Cane of Samaria, since I had been liberally using those items throughout the game to positive effect. In the wake of Breath of the Wild, where combat is stressed far more often, it's odd to travel back to a time where Zelda bosses had always been puzzles. In 2D, Link is more limited in what he can do, so instead of making bosses where combat is the focus, many of them relied on patterns instead. It's reflective of how you were meant to play the original Zelda. Trial and error, throw stuff around and see what works, except it works much better when contained in a single room against a single enemy, ideally with a pattern that doesn't dissipate in 5 seconds. That isn't to say Ages doesn't have hard-hitting, combat-focused bosses. The last one is a testament to that, a multi-form beast of a fight against Varen's many forms. You've got to avoid her fast-moving bee form, or jumping turtle form, or giant, precise spider form. Sometimes it feels like the fight will never end, testing player stamina in a way Link's Awakening never could. It almost comes out of left field. In a game that doesn't quite prepare you for combat, they throw a ridiculously hard challenge at the tail end. I'd have almost liked to see something more puzzle-focused. Something closer to Smog, a boss that requires strategy more than it requires quick reaction timing. Supposedly that's what Seasons is all about, so it feels somewhat misplaced in Ages. That brings me to my final question. Should Ages have been a game about puzzles? While puzzles are definitely an important part of Zelda, they've never defined it as a series entirely. There are explorative elements and moments of action present in even the first Zelda game. Dungeons used to more so be combat challenges than puzzles. Really, that trend began with A Link to the Past, which itself still had plenty of enemies and boss fights that held up that other pillar of Zelda. Both Ages and Seasons need to hold those pillars separately, thus isolating them into 2 distinct play experiences. Whatever element of Zelda you gravitate toward the most will likely determine which of the 2 Oracle games is more your speed. It's no surprise to me that Ages was exactly what I wanted it to be, since I love tough puzzlers. Seeing as Ages is a gigantic puzzle with the Zelda skin placed on top, I can say I got exactly what I wanted. I don't necessarily think Zelda should have to balance so many different things. For a long time, I struggled to find a justifiable reason for Zelda to still have combat, until Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild finally shook things up. I think Ages has just enough combat in it to be its own Zelda game. In other words, it doesn't have bad combat, it has minimal amounts of combat. Zelda games tend to struggle when one element doesn't work, rather than when one element is less frequent. Breath of the Wild struggles with some of its puzzles, and as such, I found it incredibly disappointing. There definitely was no shortage of puzzles, it's just that a lot of them felt very surface level. I don't mind that there are only 4 dungeons, I mind that the puzzles in those dungeons are lacking. Puzzles in Breath of the Wild frequently pale in comparison to past games. Ages doesn't hold itself back in that same way. It is an expert puzzle while also presenting a worthwhile action-based supplement. In fact, this focus on exactly what Capcom wanted Ages to be is likely why it feels so good to play. I get the feeling that some of the weaker entries in the franchise struggle to define themselves by anything other than a surface-level identity. The Wind Waker had a big open sea that you could explore, with the caveat being that there wasn't much to do in it. Ocarina of Time placed a lot of emphasis on its story, despite some of it feeling superfluous and underutilized. Skyward Sword was so hell-bent on perfecting Wii Motion Plus swordplay that it destroyed any semblance of a meaningful adventure. None of those games are bad, in fact they're all quite good, but they clearly had mixed priorities. Look at Majora's Mask. It knew exactly what it wanted to be. It was a game about impending doom and how it affected an entire region of people. Everything in it was in service to this goal. Breath of the Wild is a vast, open-world adventure, and again, everything in it was in service to this goal. Twilight Princess was an epic adventure. Everything in it was in service to this goal. The blinding linearity, the epic set pieces, while it might not be what everyone wanted from Zelda, it was clear that Twilight Princess wanted to be something. Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, Link's Awakening, Breath of the Wild, Oracle of Ages. These are the Zelda games I love, the ones that forego any sense of tradition, that ignore any need to conform, and just roll with some crazy idea or concept. It could come with unintended consequences like the lack of satisfying puzzles in Breath of the Wild or the backtracking in Majora's Mask, but the unique good outweighs the typical bad in a way some other Zelda games don't quite manage. That's why I love Oracle of Ages. I've played a hell of a lot of Zelda since I was a child, and nothing has come close to challenging my brain the way Ages does. I don't mind that its story feels less interesting, or that the music doesn't stick in my mind much, or that some of the areas are eerily reminiscent of Ocarina. What matters is that I can't get the same experience in other Zelda games. To me, such a commitment to an idea, however radical, is the recipe for success. If done right, I guess we'll see how well Oracle of Seasons is able to hold up its pillar. If you've played Zelda 1, Holodrum will give you some flashbacks, in more ways than are immediately obvious. From dungeon entrances to boss fights, Seasons takes a lot of inspiration from the original Zelda's framework. More enemies dot each screen, less barriers prevent you from going somewhere, and it echoes that terrifying survival mentality present in the original. Even in its story setup, it feels generic. You're plopped into Holodrum for seemingly no reason, are saved by Din, the Oracle of Seasons, who is immediately captured by Onox, resident big bad. He sinks the Temple of Seasons, sends Holodrum into a catastrophic fluctuation of weather events, and seals Din in his palace. Your goal is to find the 8 essences, storm Onox's lair, and save Holodrum. Much like Ages, it's more about the journey, but even more so, you can feel the roots of that Zelda 1 remake shining through. Narratively, it feels almost intentionally stripped down. I mean, hey, I love the new stuff. Subrosians are cute, oddball opposite-day dwellers, and their land of Subrosia is a surprisingly fleshed-out side location. By far the most interesting story content is located here. Going on a date with a cute girl, getting your Rock's Feather stolen by a duo of goofy thieves, saving a crew of pirates who are trapped in between the surface world and Subrosia. everything else pales in comparison. At one point you reach a flooded town and the most you get out of that is, well, looks like the town's flooded. Oh hey, I can swim now. There's just this lack of any real initiative to the plot. Ages doesn't fare much better in this department, but at least more stuff actually happens. Your tree guide falls in love with you during Ages, and you talk to her at multiple points throughout the game, including to set up the final confrontation. In Seasons, the tree guide has maybe one short speaking line until you promptly never hear from him again besides a brief set of directions here and there. You build absolutely no relationships with these characters, and it makes it hard for the story to ultimately matter. You barely know Din at all. You barely know Onox. What does it matter when you storm the final temple if the build-up doesn't feel sufficient? I often wonder if these two games are even worth connecting, since their stories feel so inconsequential, but I'll save that for the end. Seasons is supposedly the Triforce of Power, and thus the game focused on action. Players use the Rod of Seasons to control the weather: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Changing the season affects which objects you can move and/or destroy, what buildings you can access, and what mechanisms you can interact with. While Ages had time travel that affected the entire game state, Seasons relies on area chunks. When you change the season, it doesn't affect the entire world map, just the area chunk you currently reside in. I really like how changing the seasons can affect progression. Usually contained to 3 or 4 rooms, you need to find a way to a tree stump, changing to a correct season out of 4 distinct options, and hoping that you remembered that one room correctly. Some of the effects aren't immediately obvious. Why do mushrooms only grow in the fall? Or why do flowers only bloom in the spring? Or why do vines only shoot out in the summer? Spring and fall feel the most superfluous. Summer and winter are incredibly straightforward, and it almost feels like spring and fall were ripped out of summer so that all 4 seasons could at least be represented. It adds more variety and thus more complicated puzzle solutions, so I can't say I dislike it. It just has a tendency to feel inorganic at a few moments. Though you use the mechanic often in the overworld, you can tell that it wasn't stressed much overall since Seasons' focus is action. There isn't a single point at which you use the seasons within a dungeon, or where progression is significantly halted by the season switching mechanic. In fact, accessing these dungeons feels easier than ever before. Holodrum is really easy to navigate compared to Labrana. I found the 5th dungeon and completed it before the 4th dungeon on accident, because as soon as I gained the ability to swim, so much of the world was open to me. I was practically lost. At one point you need 4 sacred objects to access some ruins, and they're hidden throughout Holodrum. Hidden, as in you have to explore to find them. They aren't exactly hidden as puzzles. You sprinkle mystery seeds on something, an enemy pops out, boom, mystical object. You fall down a few waterfalls, a Vyre taunts you. You fall down a few waterfalls again, and you pick up the triangle. Labrana, as the name implies, felt super clunky to navigate, and I think this was done on purpose. Ages is a giant puzzle box, so it makes sense that the overworld would feel very strict and suffocating, with very specific pathways to take that almost all had roadblocks. Holodrum has a few blocked off areas, but is much more open. There are so many water tiles that open up to you after you get the scuba gear that it almost feels as though the world is your oyster. There are secrets hidden everywhere by burning bushes, changing seasons, bombing walls. In effect, Seasons is more about, ooh, what's that? I'm gonna go find out. And Ages is more about, whoa, how the hell do I do that? It might be more apt to call Seasons a game about adventure. That action umbrella is more evident within the dungeons. Progression in Unicorn's Cave is potentially confusing, as are most Zelda dungeons, but it feels more open. If it wasn't on the Game Boy Color, I have a feeling the first set of rooms would simply be mashed together because they're all open. While there is a correct path, what you do on said path matters more than finding the actual path. If you go westward, you'll be dropped into a room with treadmill floor tiles that you have to maneuver your way through. Rather than a traditional puzzle, this is a balancing act, a reaction-based mechanical challenge. When you eventually travel east, there are several rooms to check out and keep in the back of your head for later. Many of them have small keys. Other than that, the minecarts are used to get you from one place to another, where you'll have to complete a platforming challenge. 2D sections are a dime a dozen. This particular section has fire spewing out of tubes and projectiles that you have to time your jumps to avoid. It dumps you into a room with a few different enemy types, one with erratic movement, the other with precise movement. The erratic snakes can be hit from anywhere, but you'll be more susceptible to their damage. Whereas the masked creatures have a small weak point and hide it easily with their sharp turns. This room is all about vanquishing them, as is the room on the left. You're supposed to remember the order in which you slay the Armos here. Again, puzzle solving is still here, and it's still good, but it has more of a basis in action or combat. There are a few more enemy gauntlets in here, and they work so well because the Oracle games have a really good selection of enemies to play with. Darknuts are fast and center their attack from the front in a precise point. Avoiding them is as hard as positioning Link to get a word in edgewise. Then there are Magonisu, who shoot fireballs and constantly move far away from Link. You need to use the magnetic gloves to force them into your range, while taking care to avoid their own attacks. This is 2 straight rooms where all you need to do is fight enemies, and most of the dungeons follow this pattern. It's not that there are bad puzzles, far from it. Most of the puzzles in Seasons are competent enough to get me lost for at least a few minutes. It's that there are relatively few puzzles in comparison to other content. The Dancing Dragon dungeon has a lot of BMOS rooms where you fight Wizrobes and Stalfos, each experts at avoiding your swings by either jumping or teleporting away. You have to manage the enemies and the BMOS lasers at the same time. Wisps litter the room, especially in rooms with lots of spikes that you have to jump over, or in narrow corridors where they become harder to avoid. It has you using the Pegasus Seed jump combo far more than it was ever used in Link's Awakening. In one instance, you need to use the seeds to escape a room of collapsing floor tiles and grab the slingshot. There's another cool item. Imagine the seed shooter, except you can't shoot diagonally or bounce off walls. Instead, you upgrade it into a shotgun. I'm not kidding about that. This item is frequently used on minecarts and timing challenges to unlock keys and open doors. There seems to be a much larger focus on keys than in Ages. Since a lot of doors are opened by defeating enemies and there aren't many puzzles, a lot of the doors need to be opened with keys because keys have to be given out as rewards for a tough platforming or combat challenge. Having 3 or 4 keys at once is not an uncommon occurrence. Additionally, these dungeons all feel like, well, dungeons. Funny thing, instead of mechanical excuses to craft hard puzzles, a dungeon like the Ancient Ruins has a much simpler progression. You know, Floormasters, Darknuts, Gibdos, Stalfos, Armos, Wizrobes. So many enemies in one dungeon. Puzzles are usually contained inside rooms, whereas Ages felt like a macro-level puzzle box, Seasons feels like a micro-level moment-to-moment adventure. You're exploring a perilous tower full of booby traps and demons, with potential for treasure. The dungeon items here feel more useful for combat than the ones in Ages. The magnetic glove is one of the most creative Zelda items ever. It pushes or pulls metal objects and pushes or pulls Link if the metal object is stationary. It's a recontextualization of the hookshot, one that also allows Link to pick up metal balls and throw them at Keese. The slingshot feels more immediately useful in fighting enemies, especially once you get the shotgun spread. The Rock's Cape fits with a focus on tougher platforming and combat by giving you a double jump. The Magic Boomerang is great for crowd control. It's as if both these games, while sharing items and concepts, decided to focus on the ones that strengthened their core the most. Ages had the switch hook for harder puzzles, the seed shooter could only shoot diagonally and bounce off walls because it had the potential to create interesting puzzles, and the Cane of Samaria has literally no other use than to solve puzzles. None of this is to say that Seasons has bad dungeon design, it just has different dungeon design. The puzzles in Seasons are competent, but the focus on combat means the challenge is raised from a different angle. You'll probably die a lot to the mini-bosses and main bosses. As early as the Gnarled Root, you fight the dragon from Zelda 1. You fight a dragon! It has nothing to do with your dungeon item, you just need to avoid the fireballs and attack the head. Saiger from Unicorn's Keep, a mere mini-boss, is very challenging. He's quick and deadly, you almost need your Pegasus Seeds to avoid his attacks, and you're forced to attack the small weak point on his tail. Mothula dashes around the room, throwing fireballs, mini-moth minions, and you can fall down to a lower floor at any point, forced to start over again. Digdogger is damaged by a giant spiky ball, one that you need to move using the magnetic glove. You can't let it get too close to you or you'll damage yourself. You need to time it just right so that you can push or pull the ball into the boss, and after enough hits, you've got to squish the super fast mini variants, a task that is much harder than it sounds. All the while his base form is jumping around the room like a madman, and you're busy trying to figure out where the damn ball is going. Gleeok is an upgraded Aqua Mentis. It has 2 heads that it shoots fire out of, this time in many more varieties. You need to time your kills to get both heads at the same time so that you can move on to the body by jumping during his earthquake move, avoiding his charges, and swinging away. While many of these bosses technically utilize the dungeon's item, they're more about raw survival than some of the overt puzzles in Ages. These bosses feel like real battles. Overworld progression is made more interesting at points using the animal buddies I mentioned earlier. I love how they expand Link's moveset. The boxing kangaroo named Ricky is my favorite, since he can tornado punch enemies into oblivion, clearing out entire rooms of those pesky slimes. Dimitri can swim up waterfalls and eat sheeps, serving a vital role even after you can swim, and Moosh gives you the most jump distance, even after getting the Rock's Cape double jump. You have to think this was in some way inspired by Kirby's Dream Land 3. There are just too many coincidences here. They're all so cute. I love them. Heart pieces and rings are handled the same way. You find rings in secret chests or Gasha nuts that you plant using Gasha seeds. Heart pieces are equally well-placed secrets, making them satisfying to seek out, though I think the most substantial difference comes with the trading side quest. It's the same as ever, trade item to item to item, but when you get to the final recipient, he gives you a hint so that you can grab the Noble Sword. What's funny though, is that you can just perform the correct Lost Woods combination and get the Noble Sword without ever even starting the trade sequence, meaning that on multiple playthroughs, if you remember what the combination is, you can get the Noble Sword whenever you want. That is by far the best way to handle a trading sequence I have ever seen. There's an easier way to find it, to know that it exists, while also leaving the door open for someone to stumble across it by chance. I love that so much. You end, of course, by storming Onyx's castle, avoiding his stomps, his ball and chain, spin attacking until he morphs into a giant dragon. At which point, you use the Rock's Cape to platform onto his hands and hit him in the head. Unlike Varin, this is a very fitting final boss for such an action-heavy game, the perfect little bow on top. I suppose then I'll ask the same question. Should seasons have been focused on action? At the risk of sounding predictable, yes, I absolutely do. While it might not tickle me in the same way Ages does, it satisfies my Zelda cravings in a different way. It raises me an urge I never thought I had. An action-focused Zelda coming right off a puzzle-heavy Zelda is an interesting experience. It means that both Ages and Seasons can stand on their own effectively, while not sacrificing the elements that aren't highlighted. Seasons still has good puzzle solving, and thus the dungeons aren't hampered because of it. I used my spin attack far more in Seasons than I did in Ages, because the game itself incentivized it. I was more excited to find the Noble Sword in Seasons because I desperately needed a damage upgrade to go up against bigger threats, whereas in Ages it was a helpful, ultimately less important upgrade. Again, this commitment to an idea, however radical, is the recipe for success, and thankfully both of these games nail what they set out to do, and they complement each other well because of it. This is helped by the linked game features. Once you beat one of the games, you can enter a passcode that will allow you to continue the story in another game. I started with Ages, so when I booted up Seasons, I had 4 heart containers, began with a sword, and was able to begin dungeoning right away. Some characters even referenced my previous adventures. Hell, some characters from that adventure returned. There was a child in Ages you gave a name and watched grow over time. Come to find out that the reason that side quest exists is so that when you link your games, he can show up in the next adventure all grown up and shy. Queen Ambi showed up to tour Holodrum and see the sights, leading to one of the coolest twists I have ever seen in Zelda. Her husband, the one she built a tower for so he had a beacon to come home to, was the pirate captain all along. That's so cool. It made Seasons less of a slog for me because although the main plot had almost nothing going on, there'd be little glimpses of cool stuff happening in the background. Zelda aiding the townspeople, Twinrova scheming in the background, the return of your animal buddies, the return of King Moblin over here. I'd say the linked game system was worth it for these little Easter eggs alone, but there are even more features. You can transfer the rings you collected in your previous adventure into the next game with you, and you can take secret passcodes you learn in one game into the next one, which will unlock fairy fountains and other goodies. It also unlocks a final story, though I say that loosely because it's about 5 or 10 minutes of new content where Din and Nehru team up, send you to Twinrova, and then you fight Ganon. It's typical Zelda fare. It ends with Zelda kissing Link and proclaiming you the legendary hero of courage, wisdom, and power. Neat. It's nothing special. I was kind of expecting more, maybe a final dungeon that made use of every ability across both games. I don't know, something more than 2 boss fights and a final crossover cutscene would have been nice. I'm not necessarily complaining too much because I think the alterations to the main story are enough to warrant the system. I just feel like they could have gone further with it. You'll want to play them back to back regardless of whether or not you link them, because when combined, they make for one of the best Zelda games I've ever played. It is true that they both stand on their own. The moment I finished Ages, I put it up there with some of the greats for being the best puzzle of all. But then upon finishing Seasons, I realized that the Oracle games together reach that status. It doesn't matter whether you're a fan of action or a fan of puzzles, each game has a plethora of both, and for those who prefer one side of the spectrum, there's now an entire game that focuses on only your needs. I definitely know that I prefer Ages, but I still loved Seasons for offering a competent level of puzzle solving that not even Breath of the Wild could keep up with at points. Capcom hit it out of the damn park with their first stab at Zelda. They made 2 unique Zelda games that separate themselves from the pack and fit together as well as syrup and pancakes. That, my friends, is an achievement. Allow me to thank a few select patrons: Dominic Genjo Lengla, Lucas Waldeck, Logan Cavalier, Dan Russell, Lord Arceus, Vitros, Nicholas Ammond, Chuck Harkins, B. Shimon, my own father, Purist Bordeaux, Duke091, and Christopher Knoll. If you enjoyed the video, leave your thoughts down below. I love having discussions with all of you. That's part of the reason I do this in the first place. As ever, I hope you enjoyed. My name has been King K, and I hope you have some well-deserved fun today.